My sister begged me to be her maid of honor for 2 years. When I finally agreed, she announced I was too fat to be in her wedding photos. The dress-fitting appointment was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Saturday, and I showed up 15 minutes early because Vanessa had texted me 3 times that morning reminding me not to be late. The bridal boutique smelled like champagne and expensive fabric, all white furniture and gold accents, the kind of place where even breathing felt like it cost money. Vanessa was already there with Mom and her 2 bridesmaids from college, Kelsey and Brooke, all of them holding champagne flutes and laughing about something on Kelsey's phone. When I walked in, the laughter stopped. Vanessa looked up from the phone and her smile shifted into something tighter, more performative. She rushed over and hugged me, but I felt her body go rigid when her arms wrapped around my waist. She pulled back quickly and said the consultant would be with us shortly, her voice higher than normal, strained in a way that made my stomach clench. I'd gained about 30 pounds over the past year after my divorce from Derek and the depression that followed. 30 pounds that settled around my hips and stomach and face. 30 pounds that I barely noticed until I saw myself in photos or caught my reflection unexpectedly. Vanessa had mentioned my weight exactly once, 6 months ago, suggesting a gym membership as a birthday gift with this concerned expression that made me want to throw the gift card back at her. The consultant appeared with a rack of bridesmaid dresses in the color Vanessa had chosen, a dusty rose that looked expensive and difficult to clean. She started pulling dresses in what she called standard sizes, holding them up against Kelsey and Brooke while Vanessa nodded or shook her head. Then the consultant turned to me and paused, her eyes doing this quick assessment from my face down to my feet and back up. She asked what size I typically wore, and before I could answer, Vanessa jumped in and said, "Maybe we should measure first to be sure." The consultant brought out a measuring tape, and I had to stand there in the middle of the boutique with my arms out while she wrapped the tape around my bust, my waist, my hips, calling out numbers that Vanessa wrote down in her phone. Mom watched from the white couch with this pained expression like she was watching a car accident happen in slow motion. The consultant disappeared into the back room and returned with a dress that looked noticeably larger than what Kelsey and Brooke had tried on. She handed it to me and directed me toward the fitting room, and I could feel everyone's eyes on my back as I walked away. The dress barely zipped. I stood in the fitting room staring at myself in the 3-way mirror, the fabric pulling tight across my stomach and creating bulges in places I didn't want to acknowledge. The zipper only made it about 3/4 of the way up, leaving a gap at the top where my back fat spilled out. I looked like I was being strangled by dusty rose fabric, like the dress was actively fighting my body for dominance. I heard Vanessa's voice outside asking if I needed help, and I said I was fine. Just give me a minute. I tried exhaling completely and pulling the zipper harder, but it wouldn't budge. The consultant knocked softly and asked if she could come in, and when I opened the door, she assessed the situation immediately with this practiced sympathy that made everything worse. She said she'd need to order the dress in a larger size, and we could always take it in if needed, her voice gentle like she was talking to a wounded animal. I changed back into my regular clothes, feeling like my skin was too small, like I wanted to peel it off and leave it in the fitting room with the dress that didn't fit. When I came out, Vanessa was talking to the consultant in hushed tones near the register. I caught fragments of their conversation, something about timeline and alterations, and whether custom sizing was possible. Kelsey and Brooke were back on the couch with Mom, all of them suddenly very interested in their phones. And Vanessa saw me and plastered on another tight smile, asking if the dress worked or if we needed to look at other options. I told her what the consultant had said about ordering a larger size, and Vanessa's smile flickered. She said that would be fine, totally fine, no problem at all. But her voice had that edge again, that strained quality that suggested nothing was fine. The consultant started talking about rush fees and delivery dates, and Vanessa cut her off, saying she'd call back with a decision. We all filed out of the boutique into the parking lot where the July heat hit like a physical wall. Vanessa said she needed to run some errands and would text me later, and everyone dispersed to their cars without the usual small talk or plans for lunch. I sat in my Honda in the parking lot for 10 minutes after everyone left, watching couples walk past the boutique holding hands, watching mothers and daughters laugh together through the window. Mom called that night while I was eating leftover Chinese food directly from the container and watching reality TV in my sweatpants. She didn't even say hello, just launched into how I needed to be supportive of Vanessa during this stressful time, how planning a wedding was overwhelming, how Vanessa just wanted everything to be perfect. I asked what that had to do with me, and Mom got quiet for a beat before saying that maybe I could try a little harder with my appearance, that it wouldn't kill me to lose a few pounds before the wedding. The food turned to paste in my mouth. I asked if Vanessa had put her up to this call, and Mom insisted she was just trying to help, that she loved me and wanted me to feel confident in the photos. I told her the wedding was still 4 months away, and I'd handle my own body. Thanks. Mom sighed, this long-suffering sigh she'd perfected over decades, and said she was just being honest, that someone needed to tell me the truth since apparently nobody else would. I hung up while she was mid-sentence and threw my phone across the couch. The reality TV show kept playing, some episode about women fighting over a man who wasn't worth fighting over, and I sat there feeling like I'd been hollowed out with a spoon. Vanessa texted 3 days later asking if we could meet for coffee to discuss wedding stuff. I almost said no, almost told her I was busy or sick or dead, but I knew she'd just keep pushing until I agreed. We met at the Starbucks near her apartment, the one with the uncomfortable metal chairs that made every conversation feel temporary and transactional. She was already there when I arrived, looking annoyingly perfect in yoga pants and a tank top that showed off her flat stomach and toned arms. She'd always been the thin sister, the pretty one, the one who never had to think about calories or clothes sizes or whether chairs would hold her weight. She hugged me when I sat down, her perfume overwhelming in the small space between us. She said she was so glad I could make it because she'd been thinking a lot about the wedding and wanted to run something by me. The way she said it made my stomach drop. That careful tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news they think is actually good news. She pulled out her phone and started showing me photos of bridesmaid dresses, different styles from the one we'd looked at, asking what I thought about each one. I said they were fine, all pretty similar to what she'd already chosen, not understanding where this was going. She kept swiping through photos, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the screen, her expression getting more tense with each image. Finally, she put the phone down and looked at me directly, and I knew whatever was coming next would be bad. She said she'd been talking to her wedding photographer about the photo timeline and shot list, and he'd made some suggestions about composition and aesthetics that made a lot of sense. She said he'd recommended that the bridal party be cohesive in appearance, that everyone should fit a certain visual standard to ensure the photos looked professional and polished. I asked what that meant, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. She said the photographer had explained that sometimes having different body types in the wedding party could create visual imbalance in photos, that it might be better to have everyone match in size and height for aesthetic consistency. The words landed like physical blows. I sat there staring at my sister while she explained that she'd been thinking maybe I could participate in the wedding in a different capacity, maybe do a reading during the ceremony, or help coordinate logistics on the day itself. She said I'd still be so important and involved, just not standing up at the altar with the other bridesmaids. She said the photographer had been really specific about his vision for the photos, about creating clean lines and symmetry, and having me in the bridesmaid lineup might compromise that vision. She kept using the word vision like it was something sacred, like her photographer's aesthetic preferences mattered more than our relationship. I asked if she was uninviting me from being her maid of honor because I was fat, and she flinched at the word. She said that wasn't what she was doing at all, that this was about photography and composition, that I was making it personal when it was just practical. I stood up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the floor and everyone in the Starbucks turned to look. I told her to go fuck herself and her photographer and her perfect wedding, and I walked out while she called my name in this urgent whisper. I drove home crying so hard I had to pull over twice because I couldn't see the road. I called my best friend Lauren and told her everything through gasping sobs, and she said what the actual fuck was wrong with Vanessa, that this was the cruelest thing she'd ever heard. She said I should tell Vanessa to shove her wedding up her ass and never speak to her again. I wanted to do exactly that. Wanted to send a scorching text message outlining every reason Vanessa was a terrible person and sister, but instead I just sat in my car in my apartment parking lot feeling like someone had reached into my chest and pulled out something vital. My phone started buzzing with texts from Vanessa, long paragraphs about how I'd misunderstood, how she was just trying to be honest with me, how she'd thought I'd appreciate her straightforward communication instead of lying to spare my feelings. She said she was sorry if I was hurt, but she had to make decisions that were best for her wedding day, and she hoped I could understand and support her even if I didn't agree. Each text made me angrier, the way she framed her cruelty as honesty, the way she positioned herself as the victim of my reaction to her rejection. Mom called within an hour, which meant Vanessa had immediately run to her with a version of events that painted her as reasonable and me as hysterical. Mom said I was being ridiculous and oversensitive, that Vanessa had made a valid point about photo aesthetics, that maybe if I'd taken better care of myself this wouldn't be an issue. She said Vanessa was crying and upset because I'd made a scene and stormed out instead of having a mature conversation. I asked if she thought it was okay for Vanessa to kick me out of her wedding because of my weight, and Mom got defensive, saying that wasn't what happened, that I was twisting Vanessa's words to make myself the victim. She said I'd always been dramatic and emotional, that I took everything personally instead of being objective. I told her to stop calling me and hung up, then turned my phone off completely because I knew more calls and texts were coming. I spent the rest of the night eating ice cream directly from the carton and Googling whether you could legally disown your family. The internet said no, but suggested firm boundaries and limited contact, which seemed like a good place to start. The next morning, I woke up to 37 missed calls and 22 text messages from various family members. Apparently, Vanessa had launched a full campaign, telling everyone her version of the story where I'd completely overreacted to a reasonable suggestion about wedding photos. My Aunt Linda had sent a long text about respecting your sister's big day and not making everything about yourself. My cousin Jessica asked if I was okay, but also gently suggested that maybe Vanessa had a point about visual consistency. Even my dad, who I barely spoke to since the divorce, sent a message saying I should apologize to Vanessa and try to see things from her perspective. I felt like I was losing my mind. Like everyone around me had agreed to participate in a mass delusion where Vanessa's behavior was acceptable, and I was the problem for being hurt by it. I texted Lauren screenshots of all the messages, and she responded with a string of angry emojis and the suggestion that my entire family was trash. She wasn't wrong, but seeing it spelled out like that made me feel even more alone. I ignored everyone for 3 days, just went to work at the insurance office where I processed claims and pretended my life wasn't imploding. My coworker Denise asked if I was okay because I looked tired, and I told her I was fine, just dealing with some family stuff. She nodded sympathetically and said family was always complicated, then returned to her desk and left me alone, which was exactly what I needed. Work was the only place where nobody knew about the wedding disaster, where I could just be Lila who processed claims and ate lunch alone in her car and went home at 5:30 without anyone asking about my sister or my weight or my feelings. I let the routine of work numb me, the predictability of entering data and reviewing policies and sending emails that required no emotional investment. But every night I'd come home to more missed calls and texts, more family members weighing in with their opinions, more pressure to apologize for having feelings about being rejected. Vanessa showed up at my apartment on Thursday evening without warning. I answered the door in my pajamas even though it was only 7, and she pushed past me into my living room like she had every right to be there. She looked around at my apartment with this barely concealed judgment, taking in the dishes in the sink and the laundry piled on the chair and the general chaos of depression living. She said we needed to talk like adults and figure this out before the wedding got any closer. I asked if she was there to apologize, and she looked genuinely confused by the question. She said she had nothing to apologize for, that she'd been honest with me about the photography situation, that I was the one who'd made it ugly by storming out. She sat down on my couch uninvited and patted the cushion next to her like I was a dog she was calling over. I stayed standing by the door with my arms crossed, and she sighed dramatically. She said she loved me and wanted me at her wedding, just not as a bridesmaid, and she didn't understand why that was such a devastating concept. I asked her to explain exactly what the photographer had said, word for word. She got uncomfortable and started fidgeting with her engagement ring, twisting it around her finger in this repetitive motion that meant she was lying or hiding something. She said he'd mentioned something about cohesive aesthetics and visual balance, that all wedding photographers care about those things. I asked if he'd specifically mentioned my weight, and she went quiet. I asked again, louder this time, and she finally admitted that she'd brought up concerns about me fitting into the standard dress sizes, and the photographer had suggested alternative ways I could be involved. So the photographer hadn't actually said any of this. Vanessa had. She'd used him as a scapegoat to deliver her own cruel message, to hide behind professional advice that didn't exist. I told her to get out of my apartment, and she started crying, actual tears running down her perfect face while she insisted she was just trying to help me avoid embarrassment. She said she knew I was sensitive about my weight, and she thought giving me a different role would be kinder than making me stand next to her thin bridesmaids in photos. She was crying while explaining how her cruelty was actually mercy, how rejecting me was somehow for my own benefit. I opened the door and told her again to leave. She stood up slowly, dabbing at her eyes with her sleeve, and said she hoped I'd come around before the wedding because she really did want me there. She said Mom was right about me being overly emotional and dramatic, that I'd always made everything about myself instead of being supportive. She walked past me and paused in the doorway, turning back with this expression of genuine confusion, and asked why I couldn't just be happy for her and put my own feelings aside for one day. I slammed the door in her face hard enough that the frame rattled. I heard her crying in the hallway for a minute before her footsteps faded toward the elevator. I sat down on the floor with my back against the door and felt something inside me shift, some fundamental understanding about my relationship with my sister cracking open to reveal rot underneath. She didn't think she'd done anything wrong. She genuinely believed she was the victim in this scenario, that my hurt feelings were an inconvenience she shouldn't have to deal with. The weekend passed in a blur of ignoring phone calls and eating my feelings and watching true crime documentaries, where at least the villains were clearly identified as villains. Monday morning, I dragged myself to work and found an email from Vanessa waiting in my personal inbox, sent at 2 a.m. based on the timestamp. The subject line said, "Please read with an open heart," which should have warned me about what was coming. The email was 6 paragraphs long, single-spaced, detailing all the ways I'd hurt her over the years by being jealous of her success and appearance. She wrote that I'd always resented her for being thinner and prettier, that my weight gain was probably subconscious self-sabotage because I couldn't handle her getting married before me. She said she'd tried to help me by being honest about the bridesmaid situation, but I'd chosen to be vindictive instead of grateful. She listed specific instances from our childhood where I'd apparently been cruel or jealous, moments I barely remembered, reframing our entire relationship through a lens where she was the perpetual victim of my envy. The email ended with an ultimatum. She said if I wanted to be part of her wedding in any capacity, I needed to apologize for my behavior at Starbucks and commit to being supportive without drama. She said she'd give me until Friday to decide, and if I didn't respond by then, she'd assume I was choosing to remove myself from her life entirely. She signed it, "Love always, Vanessa," like the preceding 6 paragraphs of character assassination were an act of sisterly affection. I read the email 3 times, each read making me angrier, and then I forwarded it to Lauren without comment. Lauren called immediately and said, "Holy shit, this was sociopathic behavior," that Vanessa had just revealed herself to be a genuinely terrible person. She said I should forward the email to my entire family so they could see what Vanessa was really like, but I knew that wouldn't work. They'd find ways to excuse her, to say she was stressed or I'd taken things out of context. Vanessa had spent our entire lives cultivating her image as the perfect daughter, the successful sister, the one who did everything right, and one email wouldn't shatter that. I didn't respond to the email. I let Friday pass without acknowledgement, and Vanessa sent a follow-up message saying she was disappointed but not surprised by my silence, that she'd extended an olive branch and I'd rejected it. She said she'd need to move forward with wedding planning without me, and she hoped someday I'd realize what I'd thrown away by choosing pride over family. The language was so manipulative it made my teeth hurt. The way she positioned my refusal to apologize for being hurt as some moral failing on my part. Mom called that weekend and said I was making a huge mistake, that I'd regret missing Vanessa's wedding, that family was supposed to forgive each other. I asked if Vanessa had apologized for what she'd said, and Mom went quiet before saying Vanessa had nothing to apologize for, that she'd been trying to help me and I'd made it ugly. I told Mom I was done discussing it and hung up. The calls and texts slowly decreased over the next few weeks as my family apparently decided I was a lost cause, someone who'd chosen to be difficult instead of falling in line. Work became my refuge, the only place where I was just Lila the claims processor, not Lila the difficult sister or Lila who was too fat for wedding photos. I started staying late, volunteering for extra projects, anything to avoid going home to my empty apartment where I'd just obsess over my broken family. My supervisor, Janet, noticed and pulled me aside to say she appreciated my initiative but wanted to make sure I wasn't burning out. I assured her I was fine, just focused on my career, and she seemed satisfied with that answer. The truth was, I needed the distraction, needed the routine of work to keep me from spiraling into depression again. I'd fought so hard to crawl out of the hole after my divorce from Derek, and I refused to let Vanessa push me back into it. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Reeves who specialized in family trauma and toxic relationships. She listened to the whole story without judgment and said what Vanessa had done was emotionally abusive, that using someone's physical appearance to exclude them from important events was a form of cruelty disguised as practicality. Dr. Reeves helped me understand that Vanessa had probably always seen me as competition, that my weight gain had given her a socially acceptable reason to exclude me while framing it as concern for photography. She said families often had scapegoats, one person who got blamed for all the dysfunction while the real problems went unaddressed. In my family, I was apparently that scapegoat, the one who was too sensitive, too emotional, too difficult. Vanessa got to be perfect and I got to be the problem, and everyone had agreed to maintain that dynamic because it was easier than examining the actual issues. Dr. Reeves suggested I consider going no contact with my family for a while, at least until after the wedding, to give myself space to heal without constant pressure and criticism. The idea of cutting off my entire family felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. I'd spent 32 years trying to earn their approval, trying to be good enough for people who'd apparently decided I never would be. Maybe it was time to stop trying. I blocked Vanessa's number and email, and then I blocked Mom and the various aunts and cousins who kept sending me guilt trip messages about family obligations. I kept my dad unblocked because he barely reached out anyway, and when he did, it was usually to ask for money or complain about his new wife. Lauren threw me a divorce your family party at her apartment with cheap wine and expensive cheese and a cake that said, "Blood isn't thicker than common sense," in purple frosting. Her girlfriend Amber was there along with a few other friends from our college days, and everyone took turns sharing their own toxic family stories. It felt good to be around people who understood that sometimes the healthiest thing you could do was walk away from family who treated you like garbage. We got drunk and made increasingly ridiculous toasts, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe without someone criticizing the sound of it. The wedding was scheduled for October 15th, which gave me 3 months to figure out my life without my family in it. I threw myself into therapy and work and self-care routines that Dr. Reeves recommended. I started going to a gym that was specifically for women, where nobody judged you for being out of shape or needing modifications. I went 3 times a week not to lose weight for Vanessa, but to feel strong in my own body, to reclaim physical space I'd learned to minimize. I meal prepped healthy foods on Sundays and stopped eating my feelings every night. I wasn't trying to transform into someone else. I was just trying to take care of myself in ways I'd neglected during the depression after my divorce. The weight started coming off slowly, maybe a pound a week, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was feeling like I had control over something when everything else felt chaotic. Lauren came with me to a plus-size boutique in August where I bought clothes that actually fit my body instead of hiding it. The sales associate, a woman named Shanice with incredible style, helped me pick out pieces that were flattering and comfortable, that made me feel beautiful instead of apologetic about taking up space. And I bought a deep green dress that hugged my curves and made my eyes look brighter, and when I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked thinner, but because I looked confident, like someone who wasn't apologizing for existing. Shanice said I should wear that confidence everywhere, that the world needed more women who refused to shrink themselves to make others comfortable. I wore the green dress to a work event the following week and got more compliments than I'd received in years. Janet said I looked radiant and asked what had changed, and I told her I'd stopped trying to be someone I wasn't. She nodded like that made perfect sense and said whatever I was doing, I should keep doing it. September arrived, and with it came an unexpected text from my cousin Jessica. She said she'd been thinking about what happened between me and Vanessa, and the more she thought about it, the worse it seemed. She said she'd talked to her therapist about it, and her therapist had said what Vanessa did was unacceptable, that appearance-based exclusion from weddings was a form of body shaming that caused real psychological damage. Jessica apologized for not speaking up earlier, for suggesting Vanessa had a point, and asked if we could meet for coffee. I was hesitant because Jessica had been firmly on Vanessa's side, but Dr. Reeves said sometimes people needed time to process things, that not everyone who made mistakes was irredeemable. We met at a different Starbucks, one without the traumatic associations, and Jessica immediately hugged me and said she was sorry for being blind to how cruel Vanessa had been. She said she'd started noticing other things about Vanessa, small comments and behaviors that seemed innocent on the surface but revealed something mean underneath. Jessica said Vanessa had been making jokes about my absence from the wedding, telling people I'd chosen to sit out because I was jealous of her happiness. She'd been spinning the story to make herself look magnanimous and me look petty, and Jessica had finally seen through it. Jessica said other family members were starting to question Vanessa's version of events too, that people were noticing inconsistencies in her story. Apparently, Vanessa had told Mom I'd refused to be in the wedding because I wanted to wear a different dress than the bridesmaids, but she'd told Aunt Linda I was too busy with work, and she'd told our grandmother I was dealing with mental health issues that made me unreliable. The stories didn't match up, and people were starting to wonder why Vanessa needed to lie if she was really the victim. Jessica said she'd brought this up at a family dinner, and Vanessa had gotten defensive and angry, which made people even more suspicious. The cracks in Vanessa's perfect image were finally starting to show, and I felt vindicated in a way that surprised me with its intensity. October arrived, and I still hadn't heard anything from Vanessa directly, but I heard plenty through Jessica, who'd become my inside source on wedding drama. Apparently, the photographer Vanessa had blamed for the exclusion advice didn't exist, or rather, He did exist, but had never said anything about bridesmaid body types. Jessica had done some digging and discovered Vanessa hadn't even hired a photographer yet when she'd had the Starbucks conversation with me. She'd been shopping around for photographers, using their services as leverage in negotiations, and the body type conversation had never happened with any of them. Vanessa had invented the whole thing as a way to exclude me while avoiding blame, using a fictional professional opinion to mask her own cruelty. Jessica was furious when she figured this out, and she'd confronted Vanessa at a bridesmaid dress fitting. Vanessa had admitted she'd exaggerated the photographer's concerns but insisted it was based on real aesthetic principles she'd researched. Jessica said the other bridesmaids, Kelsey and Brooke, had looked uncomfortable during this exchange, but hadn't said anything, which told me everything about the kind of people Vanessa surrounded herself with. The wedding was 2 weeks away when I got a call from an unknown number at work. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was male, uncertain, asking if I was Lila Sutherland. I confirmed, and he introduced himself as Owen Alvarez, Vanessa's fiancé, and my stomach dropped. Owen said he needed to talk to me about something important, that he'd heard my side of the wedding situation from Jessica, and wanted to hear it directly from me. I asked why he cared, and he was quiet for a long moment before saying he was starting to see sides of Vanessa he hadn't noticed before, that planning this wedding had revealed character traits that worried him. We agreed to meet for lunch the next day at a restaurant halfway between my office and his dental practice. I told Lauren about it that night, and she said this was either really good or really bad, that Owen reaching out meant something significant was happening. She made me promise to text her updates during the lunch and to leave immediately if Owen turned out to be just as bad as Vanessa. Owen was already at the restaurant when I arrived, sitting in a back booth looking nervous and exhausted. He stood up when he saw me and shook my hand formally, like we were business associates instead of family who should have known each other better. He thanked me for meeting him and said he'd been trying to figure out how to have this conversation for weeks. We ordered food neither of us touched while Owen explained what had been happening. He said Vanessa had told him I'd dropped out of the wedding because I was jealous of their relationship, that I'd always been competitive with her and couldn't handle her being happy. But then Jessica had told him the truth about the body shaming and the fake photographer excuse, and he'd realized his fiancé was capable of a level of cruelty he'd never witnessed before. He said he'd confronted Vanessa about it and she'd gotten defensive and angry, accusing him of taking my side over hers, of not supporting her during the stressful wedding planning process. She'd cried and insisted she'd only been trying to spare me embarrassment, that everything she'd done came from a place of love. Owen said he'd let it go initially because weddings made people crazy, and he figured the stress was bringing out the worst in everyone. But then he'd started noticing other things. The way Vanessa talked about people behind their backs, the casual cruelty in her comments about other women's appearances, the way she manipulated situations to make herself look good while making others look bad. He said she'd been planning this wedding for 2 years, since before they were even engaged, and the level of control and image management was starting to feel pathological. She had spreadsheets tracking every detail, backup plans for backup plans, and an obsession with the photos that went beyond normal bride behavior. Owen said she'd mentioned several times that she wanted the wedding photos to look like they could be in a magazine, that everything needed to be perfect because these photos would represent her forever. When he'd suggested maybe perfection wasn't the goal, that genuine happiness mattered more than aesthetics. She'd gotten genuinely upset and said he didn't understand how important this was to her. I asked Owen why he was telling me all this, and he took a long breath before saying he wasn't sure he should marry Vanessa. The words hung in the air between us like something physical and dangerous. He said he loved her, or at least he loved who he thought she was. But he was starting to realize the person he'd fallen for might have been a carefully constructed performance. He said the way she'd treated me was unforgivable, and if she could be that cruel to her own sister, what did that say about her capacity for empathy in general? He asked if she'd always been like this, or if this was new behavior, and I had to be honest. I told him Vanessa had always been image-obsessed and competitive, but I'd written it off as normal sister stuff, as her dealing with her own insecurities by putting me down. I told him about growing up with her, how she'd always needed to be the prettiest, the smartest, the most successful, how she'd cultivated relationships based on what they could do for her social status, rather than genuine connection. I told him about the time in high school when she'd sabotaged my relationship with a guy she thought was too good-looking to date me, or the way she'd undercut my college achievements by telling family members I'd barely passed classes she'd excelled in. Owen listened with this increasingly horrified expression, and I realized he was seeing Vanessa clearly for maybe the first time. He said he needed to make a decision soon, that the wedding was in 13 days and deposits were non-refundable, and family was flying in from across the country. I told him that was a terrible reason to marry someone, and he laughed this hollow sound that had no humor in it. He said he knew that, but breaking off the engagement now would be catastrophic, would hurt so many people beyond just Vanessa, would cost tens of thousands of dollars and require explanations he wasn't ready to give. I said hurting people now was better than hurting them worse later, that marrying someone out of obligation or sunk cost was a recipe for misery. I told him about my divorce from Derek, how I'd stayed 2 years longer than I should have because I was afraid of admitting failure, of letting people down, of starting over. Those 2 years had cost me so much more than just time. They'd cost me my sense of self, my confidence, my ability to trust my own judgment. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, not even Owen, who'd been complicit in Vanessa's cruelty by not standing up to her sooner. We sat in that booth for 3 hours talking about everything. Owen told me about his family, his mother who'd died of cancer when he was 16, his fear of being alone that made him overlook red flags in relationships. I told him about my struggles with depression and body image, about the therapy I was in and the work I was doing to rebuild myself after letting someone else define my worth. We talked about Vanessa and her patterns, the way she needed constant validation and couldn't handle anyone else getting attention or praise. Owen said he'd noticed that at his dental practice, how Vanessa would get jealous when his colleagues complimented his work, how she'd find ways to diminish his accomplishments while centering herself. He said she'd convinced him to buy a house that was outside his budget because she needed a specific aesthetic for Instagram photos, and now they were financially stretched before they'd even gotten married. The picture he painted was of someone fundamentally incapable of being a true partner, someone who could only exist at the center of everything. When we finally left the restaurant, Owen thanked me for being honest with him. He said he had a lot to think about and some difficult conversations ahead of him. I told him to do what was right for him, not what was easiest or most socially acceptable, and he nodded like he was filing that advice away for later. We hugged in the parking lot and it felt like some kind of ending, though I wasn't sure to what. I texted Lauren immediately with updates and she called within seconds, yelling that this was insane, that Owen was clearly going to call off the wedding, that Vanessa's perfect image was about to implode in spectacular fashion. I told her not to get ahead of things, that Owen was just processing, but privately I wondered if Lauren was right. Owen had seemed genuinely shaken by our conversation, like he'd finally seen something he couldn't unsee, and that kind of clarity usually led to action. 3 days before the wedding, Jessica texted me that Owen had called off the engagement. She said he'd done it privately at Vanessa's apartment, that she'd come home from work to find him sitting on the couch with his bags already packed. He'd told her he couldn't marry someone who treated people with the level of cruelty she'd shown me, that he'd seen a side of her character that scared him, and he needed to walk away before they made a permanent mistake. Vanessa had apparently lost her mind, screaming and crying and begging him to reconsider, saying she'd apologize to me, she'd fix everything, she'd be better. But Owen had been firm, had said some things couldn't be fixed with apologies, that her willingness to hurt her own sister for aesthetic reasons revealed something fundamental about her values that he couldn't overlook. He'd left while she was still crying, had gotten in his car and driven away from the life they'd been planning for 2 years. Jessica said she'd never seen anything like it, the absolute destruction on Vanessa's face when she realized her perfect image was crumbling. The family group chat exploded with the news. Mom was furious, demanding to know what Owen was thinking, saying he'd humiliated Vanessa just days before the wedding. Aunt Linda was more practical, asking about vendor cancellations and whether deposits could be recovered. My dad, in his first contribution to the chat in months, said something cryptic about people getting what they deserved. Jessica told me privately that several family members were asking questions about what had really happened between me and Vanessa, that Owen had apparently mentioned my name when explaining his decision. People were starting to piece together that maybe Vanessa's version of events hadn't been entirely truthful, that maybe I'd had legitimate reasons for stepping away from the wedding. The narrative was shifting, and Vanessa's carefully constructed victim story was falling apart under scrutiny. Mom tried to do damage control, insisting that whatever issues there were between sisters shouldn't have ended an engagement, but even she sounded uncertain, like she was starting to wonder what she'd missed. Vanessa called me from a blocked number the night before what would have been her wedding day. I answered without thinking and immediately regretted it when I heard her voice, raw from crying, asking if I was happy now that I'd destroyed her life. She said Owen had admitted to talking to me, that our conversation had poisoned him against her, that everything falling apart was my fault. She called me bitter and jealous and pathetic, said I couldn't handle her being happy, so I'd sabotaged her relationship. I listened to her rant for about 30 seconds before I interrupted and told her Owen made his own decision based on her behavior, that I'd simply been honest when he'd asked for honesty. I told her that excluding me from her wedding for being fat was cruel regardless of how she tried to justify it, that using a fake photographer excuse made it worse, that lying to the family about why I'd stepped away revealed character flaws no amount of perfect wedding photos could hide. She started crying again, that manipulative crying she'd perfected as a teenager, and said she'd only ever wanted her wedding to be beautiful, that she didn't understand why everyone was punishing her for having standards. I told her that beauty built on cruelty wasn't beautiful at all, that she'd prioritized aesthetics over humanity, and now she was facing the consequences of that choice. She screamed that I was a terrible sister who'd never supported her, that I'd always been jealous of everything she had, that my weight gain was just an excuse to make myself the victim when really I was the problem. The venom in her voice was familiar, that tone she used when she was losing control and lashing out at whoever was closest. I told her to lose my number and never contact me again, and I hung up while she was mid-sentence. I blocked the number she'd called from and sat in my apartment feeling strangely empty, like I'd just closed a door on something that had been poisoning me for years. Lauren texted asking if I was okay, and I told her I was better than okay. I was free. Free from the obligation to accept mistreatment from people who shared my DNA, free from the guilt of prioritizing my own well-being, free from Vanessa's poisonous presence in my life. The next morning, October 15th, I woke up and went to a yoga class at my gym. The instructor, a woman named Kira who radiated calm energy, led us through a flow that focused on releasing tension and negative energy. I thought about Vanessa throughout the class, about the wedding that wasn't happening, about the venue sitting empty and the guests confused and the deposits lost. I thought about Owen making the hardest decision of his life because he'd seen something in Vanessa that he couldn't ignore. I thought about my family and how they'd handle the fallout, whether they'd finally see Vanessa's cruelty or find new ways to excuse it. But mostly I thought about myself, about the journey I'd been on since that dress fitting in July, about the work I'd done in therapy and the boundaries I'd set, and the life I was building without people who treated me like I was disposable. When the class ended and we all lay in final savasana, I felt tears running down into my hair, and realized I was grieving the sister I'd thought I had, while simultaneously celebrating my freedom from the sister she actually was. Jessica called that afternoon to tell me Vanessa had sent a group text to the entire family claiming Owen had left her for another woman, that she was the victim of betrayal, and everyone needed to support her through this difficult time. Jessica said about half the family was buying this new story, but the other half was asking questions and demanding details that Vanessa couldn't provide. Owen had apparently sent his own message to key family members explaining that he'd left because he'd discovered character issues he couldn't overlook, and while he didn't name me specifically, he mentioned learning about cruel treatment of family members that revealed fundamental problems with Vanessa's empathy. Some people were putting the pieces together, asking why I hadn't been at recent family events, why I'd suddenly blocked everyone on social media, why Vanessa's story about my involvement in the wedding kept changing. The truth was emerging whether Vanessa wanted it to or not, and she was losing control of the narrative for the first time in her life. Mom called me the following week, her voice strained and careful. She said she'd talked to Owen privately, and he'd told her everything, including what Vanessa had said to me about being too fat for the wedding photos. Mom said she was sorry for not believing me, for siding with Vanessa automatically, for making me feel like my hurt didn't matter. She said she'd been so focused on supporting Vanessa through wedding planning that she'd ignored obvious signs of problematic behavior, that she'd let her desire for a picture-perfect wedding cloud her judgment about her daughter's treatment of people. She asked if we could meet to talk, and I told her I needed time, that her apology was a start, but I'd spent months being vilified by my family, and one phone call didn't erase that damage. She said she understood and would give me space, but she wanted me to know she loved me and was sorry. It was the first time in my life I'd heard Mom apologize for something significant, and while it didn't fix everything, it shifted something inside me. Over the next few months, various family members reached out with apologies and explanations. Aunt Linda said she felt terrible for making assumptions without knowing the full story. My cousin Michael said he'd always thought Vanessa was kind of mean, but assumed it was just sister dynamics. Even my dad sent an actual heartfelt message saying he was proud of me for standing up for myself, that he wished he'd been brave enough to do the same when he was younger. The family slowly split into factions, those who believed Vanessa was a victim of circumstances, and those who'd finally seen her clearly. Vanessa herself doubled down on her narrative, posting cryptic social media messages about betrayal and people showing their true colors, about rising above negativity and choosing happiness despite others trying to tear you down. She'd started dating someone new within 6 weeks of the canceled wedding, posting photos of romantic dinners and weekend getaways with captions about finding someone who truly appreciated her. The guy looked vaguely familiar, and Jessica eventually figured out he was Trevor, one of Owen's colleagues from his dental practice, which added another layer of chaos to the whole situation. I kept going to therapy, kept working on myself, kept building a life that felt authentic instead of performed. I got promoted at work to a senior claims position with better pay and more responsibility. I joined a book club at my local library and made new friends who didn't know anything about the wedding drama, who liked me for who I was without the baggage of family history. Lauren and Amber invited me to be in their wedding when they got engaged, and I cried when Lauren asked because it felt like reclaiming something Vanessa had stolen from me. I started dating someone I met at the gym, a guy named Marcus who was patient and kind and thought I was beautiful exactly as I was. We took things slow, and I was honest about my baggage, about the therapy and the family trauma and the work I was still doing. He said everyone had baggage, and what mattered was whether you were working on it or letting it define you. On our third date, he asked about my family, and I told him the whole story, expecting him to run for the hills. But instead he just said my sister sounded like a nightmare and he was glad I'd set boundaries with people who treated me badly. A year after the canceled wedding, Vanessa got engaged to Trevor. She sent a mass text to the family announcing the engagement with a photo of her ring and a caption about finding her soulmate and getting a second chance at happiness. Several family members were uncomfortable with how fast she'd moved on, how she was repeating the same patterns with someone new, but nobody said anything directly to her. Mom called to ask if I was okay with the news, and I told her honestly I didn't care what Vanessa did as long as she left me alone. I'd done enough work in therapy to understand that Vanessa's behavior wasn't about me, that her need for external validation and perfect aesthetics came from her own deep insecurities and inability to be genuine. I felt sorry for Trevor, walking into a relationship with someone who valued appearance over substance, but that was his lesson to learn. I focused on my own life, my own healing, my own joy that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval or validation. Vanessa eventually married Trevor in a small ceremony with minimal fanfare, nothing like the elaborate wedding she'd planned with Owen. Jessica told me about it afterwards, how Vanessa had seemed anxious and controlling throughout the planning, how she'd made similar comments about bridesmaid appearances that made people uncomfortable. Apparently she'd asked one of Trevor's cousins to lose weight before the wedding, and the cousin had declined to be in the wedding party, rather than deal with the body shaming. History repeating itself, the same patterns playing out with new victims, proving that Vanessa hadn't learned anything from the disaster with Owen. She just found someone more willing to tolerate her behavior, someone who either didn't see the red flags or chose to ignore them. I wondered how long it would last, but then decided I didn't actually care, that wondering about Vanessa's life meant giving her space in my head she no longer deserved. 2 years after the original wedding disaster, I stood in Lauren's wedding as her maid of honor, wearing a beautiful burgundy dress that fit perfectly and made me feel gorgeous. The wedding was intimate and genuine, full of laughter and happy tears and moments of real connection. Lauren and Amber wrote their own vows, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room when they promised to choose each other every day, to be honest even when it was hard, to build a life based on substance rather than appearance. During the reception, Lauren pulled me aside and thanked me for standing with her, said that watching me survive my family's cruelty and come out stronger had inspired her to be braver in her own life. She said I was proof that you could walk away from toxic people and build something better, that blood didn't obligate you to accept mistreatment. We hugged and cried and laughed, and I felt genuinely happy in a way I hadn't been sure I'd ever feel again after that Starbucks conversation with Vanessa. Dr. Reeves and I eventually reached a place where I only needed monthly sessions instead of weekly ones, where I'd built enough coping skills and self-awareness to navigate life without constant guidance. She said I'd done remarkable work confronting my patterns of people-pleasing and accepting crumbs of affection from people who should have given me full meals. She said setting boundaries with family was one of the hardest things people could do, that most people never found the courage, and she was proud of how far I'd come. On our last regular session, she asked what I'd learned from everything that happened with Vanessa, and I told her I'd learned that some people will never see you clearly if doing so requires them to examine their own behavior. I'd learned that you can't make people treat you well by becoming smaller or more convenient. I'd learned that the right people will value you for who you are rather than how you make them look. Most importantly, I'd learned that walking away from people who hurt you isn't giving up on family, it's choosing yourself, and that choice can save your life. I still saw some family members occasionally, the ones who'd apologized and meant it, who'd done their own work examining how they'd contributed to a dynamic that allowed Vanessa's cruelty to flourish. Mom and I had lunch once a month, slowly rebuilding trust and learning to have an adult relationship based on honesty, rather than obligation. Jessica became one of my closest friends, bonded by shared understanding of how families could implode when someone finally refused to pretend everything was fine. I kept Marcus and most families separate, not wanting to expose him to drama he didn't need, but eventually he met the safe people, and they loved him like I did. Life became quieter but fuller, smaller but more authentic, and I realized I preferred this version of existence where I knew people truly cared about me, rather than what I could do for their image. 3 years after she excluded me from her wedding for being too fat to be in photos, I ran into Vanessa at a coffee shop near my office. She was alone, looking at her phone, and didn't see me at first. I almost left, but something made me stay, made me order my coffee and sit at a nearby table. When she finally looked up and saw me, her face went through a series of expressions, surprise and discomfort, and something that might have been shame. She came over and asked if she could sit, and I said sure, curious about what she wanted. She looked older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age, and when she spoke, her voice lacked its usual confident edge. She said she'd been thinking about me, about what happened, about the things she'd said and done. She said she was in therapy now working on her relationship patterns, that Trevor had insisted on couples counseling, and it had revealed some uncomfortable truths about how she treated people. I listened without reacting, and she kept talking, apologizing for excluding me, for the cruel words, for lying to the family, for not seeing how her behavior had hurt me until it was too late. She said losing Owen had been devastating but necessary, that it had forced her to look at herself honestly for the first time, and what she'd seen hadn't been pretty. She asked if we could maybe start over, rebuild some kind of relationship, and I told her gently but firmly that I didn't think that was possible. Some bridges, once burned, leave foundations too damaged to rebuild, and I'd worked too hard on my healing to risk it by letting her back into my life. She nodded like she'd expected that answer, and we said goodbye in that coffee shop, releasing each other from the obligation of sisterhood we'd never actually fulfilled. I walked out into afternoon sunshine feeling lighter than I had in years, no longer carrying the weight of trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it freely, finally, completely free.